Hey everyone, this is Andrew Gormley for net.tutsplus.com, and today we're going to talk about responsive web design using CSS3's awesome media queries. Before we jump right into coding though, it's important to understand what responsive web design is. So to me, responsive web design, first and foremost, is good front-end development, plain and simple. We're talking about well-formed, valid HTML coupled with clean, sensible CSS. And then from there, you're going to take these CSS3 media queries, and what they do is allow us to scale a site for viewing on any number of platforms and devices, each with different screen sizes, resolutions, you name it. Thanks to the advanced web browsers on smartphones and tablets, well-coded websites tend to look pretty good with the right amount of pinching and tapping anyway. But wouldn't it be nice to have a unique experience by reusing all of your existing code without needing to redirect users to the de facto m.yourdomain.com? People who enjoy visiting your website on their smartphone while they're commuting or on their iPads from the comfort of their couch should get an experience uniquely optimized to match that reading preference, and that is where these media queries come in. So before we get started, I'm just going to run through a few quick examples of what I'm referring to so you can get an idea about what we're going to learn. Okay, so here's a really cool site called Tilables, and what they do is they offer seamless patterns for use in your Photoshop, firework designs, and things like that. So this site uses media queries for 4 distinct layout types. The first one is wide for viewing on desktop browsers, which is what we're looking at right now. If we start to scale it down just a little bit, you'll see that this automatically switches to a much narrower design, and this might be for viewing on, say, an iPad in portrait mode. We scale down a little bit further, and this is the beginnings of a mobile view, I would say, or for really, really small screens. And then you scale down one more time, and this is actually the smartphone. This would be for smartphones like an iPhone or a Droid or something like that. You see everything's really nicely laid out in list item format from top to bottom. An interesting thing to note about this site is that they've actually removed 2 primary navigation items here, and that's an important thing to take into consideration when you're working with media queries. It's not always about what to move and how to move it, but sometimes what elements to remove from the page. So let's scale this back up and move over to our next example. And this is Cognition, the blog of HappyCog. So you should definitely be following these guys if you're not, because they're putting out so much good content, it's not even fair. But the changes here are a little bit more subtle, and they mainly involve font size and image scaling and moving them around a little bit. You'll notice it mostly right here with these articles, or at least most drastically here. So we start to scale down a little bit, and you'll see these changes happen. So right now it turned into a semi-fluid layout, and you see the images are scaling up and down as well as the text and some of the margins. Now we've put these into a list item format, a vertical list item instead of horizontal across. We scale down one more time, and you see that the images have disappeared completely, and you're left with just the content, which is a really excellent way to approach this, and it just looks really good overall. So let's scale this back up. The blog of Mr. Simon Collison is the quintessential example of media queries in use, and it's the first one that I really recall from memory being like, wow, this is really amazing. So you can see the elements here are arranged in a really nice 4-column grid for desktop browsers from top to bottom. When we scale down a little bit, you see it switches over to 2 columns, and then eventually down to 1 column for viewing on a smartphone. And the one thing to notice here is that none of the content is actually removed. None of the images or titles or text changes, literally just the position, and it makes for an excellent user experience. So we have one more to show you, and that is media queries. So this is a great resource for viewing other sites that utilize media queries. I actually took a couple of my examples from here. What you'll notice is that this is a source of design inspiration as well as a way for you to determine how to position some of the elements on your site as you transition to a responsive design. Your first one is going to be a little bit difficult. You're going to have troubles moving things around and finding your groove, but coming here and taking a look at what these people are doing, seeing what the pros are up to, is a really excellent way to influence your own design. So just to sum everything up thus far, last time, media queries are a feature of CSS3 that let you query the browser for information and then, based on that information, carry out a particular set of tasks. Some of the techniques we'll be going over will feel pretty familiar to those of you who worked with JavaScript, jQuery, Dojo, and other DOM manipulation tools because prior to having media queries, those were the libraries you would use to accomplish a lot of these tasks. The great thing about media queries are that they're supported natively in all modern desktop browsers, and that includes, by some glorious miracle, Internet Explorer 9. Icing on the cake is that nearly every mobile browser also supports this right out of the box, so we have a really large playing field to work with here. So here's a typical two-column layout you might find on something like a WordPress blog. The main content is over here on the left, and the mostly meta type of information like an abstract, recent posts, maybe recent tweets or Facebook fans would be over here on the right. This entire layout is wrapped in a 1200 pixel container div, and each of the columns you see right here, this one and this one, are fixed width divs. Now, on a desktop or a notebook, this design would look pretty sweet. I mean, foregoing its simplicity, it's got plenty of breathing room, the padding and margin, fonts are all really nice size, easy to read. But if you were to look at this on an iPad, iPhone, or Android device, you would definitely get scaling or scroll bars. So on an iPhone, iPad, you might get something that looks like this, where the text of the body is not very readable. Maybe on an Android device, like a tablet, you would have to scroll left and right and up and down to get the full gist of the page. Here's a quick glimpse of the code that's running the site. You can see it's pretty basic for the purposes of this demo, lots of lorem ipsum, a couple of HTML5 elements, but nothing too fancy. One thing to note is that I'm calling my styles as usual. There is absolutely no trickery here. You can choose to add entirely new style sheets with media queries, or just add these media queries to your existing code. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to work within the current style sheets, but at the end I will show you how to add them separately. Let's start by going to the bottom of this site CSS right here. And the first thing I want to do is set up a comment telling me which device I'm going to target. So let me just copy this one right here. And this is for viewports that are less than 1200 pixels wide. Let's also write our first media query and just run a quick test to make sure that everything's working fine. So it's really simple writing a media query. All you have to do is do the @ symbol, media, then you specify a condition. So in this case, I want to say max width 1200 pixels, curly bracket, and that's pretty much it. Let's add our quick test. Let's say div background red. Switch over to our site, refresh the page, and we'll start to scale down. And once we hit less than 1200 pixels, something should turn red here. Whoa, that is pretty ugly. But as you can see, once you have declared the media query, it's pretty much business as usual with the CSS. We're talking about the same curly brackets, same selectors, pseudo selectors, and rules. We've simply limited the scope of these styles to apply only when the particular conditions are met. If you grasp this basic concept of media queries, and that is basically the whole concept, then you're pretty much on your way to becoming a master of this stuff. The hardest part of responsive web design, for me personally at least, is choosing the target resolutions, so which ones you actually want to work with, and then planning how your layout responds to those particular sizes. In this tutorial, we'll be going over 5 layout variations right here, which isn't unheard of, but you'll see more and more that it's actually pretty common to see 4. The main site, smaller main site, one optimized for a tablet, and then one optimized for a smartphone. Our primary focus with each step down will be to reduce the overall page width, some margins, font sizes, maybe the size of this image right here, maybe size that down or remove it completely, to be able to fit all of this content comfortably in a smaller viewport. So let's get started. We're just right out of the gate, we're going to reduce the size of the container and our 2 columns. So let me get Safari back up to size here. And we'll switch back over to our code. We will remove our test. And let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is adjust the size of the container down to something more manageable. Let's say the width is 960 pixels. Then the content, we will bring that down to 700 pixels. And then finally the sidebar, we will set that to be 240 pixels. Really simple, really straightforward. Let's switch back over to the site and see what we see. Refresh, start to scale down. Okay, and the changes have taken place. You see that the columns are a little bit less wide right now. One thing I did notice though in sizing down the container is that it messed up our header, obviously. So what we'll have to do is definitely adjust these heading font sizes as well as the font size and width of the navigation here. Another thing I'd like to begin doing pretty early on right now is removing some of the vertical space between elements. So we're going to adjust some of the margin bottoms, especially on these the articles over here and the asides in the sidebar. And I think the final thing I want to do is bring this font size down a bit. So at a really wide level, it looks really good, but that can get pretty out of hand quickly. So let's do all of those things right now. The first thing is to attack the headings. So they are header, H group, H1. We will adjust that font size down to 32 pixels. And header, H group, H2. And we will adjust that font size down to 18 pixels. The nav is up next, so we will say header, nav. And because we brought these font sizes down, it's going to move everything up a little bit. So I'm going to adjust the margin top here to 18 pixels. And I'm also, like I said, going to bring down the actual font size of the list items. In this case, let's just say 14. I believe they're 18 right now. The banner of text that runs along the top of the page here, I am going to begin to reduce the margin on the bottom of that as well. And the last thing to do is adjust the margin bottom of the articles and the asides and the font size of the articles. So let me just do that really quickly. Okay, now that all that's done, let's preview this and see what we can see. Refresh the page, and let's start to scale this down. Boom. There's our first change, and that looks great. The nav falls back into place like we wanted it to, and the headings are a bit smaller, but good. Everything moves up just a little bit to accommodate the smaller viewport. Overall, everything looks really good. Now, because this layout is 960 pixels, this would actually probably look really good on an iPad in landscape mode, but I want to make some specific changes for the iPad to increase tap areas and things like that. So the next device we're going to target is actually the iPad in landscape mode, and with that we will introduce a couple new queries. So again, I'm going to get a comment going. And this query is going to introduce something new. So take a look. So you'll notice right there that it's not max width, it's actually max device width. So what that does is it looks at the current resolution of whatever device is being used to view the site, and it takes the largest number. So in the case of the iPad with a resolution of 1024 by 768, 1024 is the maximum width the device is capable of displaying. So this is actually a target for the iPad. I want to add one other thing here before I add my curly brackets. And orientation landscape, media queries can actually detect how the user is holding their device. So in this instance, we're targeting devices in landscape with a max device width of 1024. That sounds exactly like an iPad to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a couple quick changes to account for the iPad that I want to do. I'm going to speed up the video, and then at the end we're going to go back and take a look at everything that I did. Okay, so let's just go over these changes really quick before we preview the site. Basically, I took the container and I set the width to 768 and I split that up accordingly between the content and the sidebar. I reduced some of the margins on the header and the header H group. The nav, I decided to remove its float and clear both so it falls underneath the headings. I set the width of the UL to 100%, and each individual nav item has a font size of 14, a hard width of 191 pixels, and they are now centered. The last child, the last LI in the nav, has a width of 192 because the previous three have a margin, a border right rather, of 1 pixel. The banner, I've reduced a little bit of the margin bottom, and here the content article image, I've removed its float, set its bottom margin to 10 pixels, and set its width to 100% so that it'll fill the content div. Let's take a look and see what it looks like. Refresh, and let's scale down. There's our first change, and well, what happened? The reason we can't see these changes is because my current configuration does not match either of the media queries. My current max device width is 1680, and the desktop browser doesn't have an orientation. So what we'll need to do while we're working on this on the desktop is alter the query in order to be able to see these changes, which is easy enough. We actually just follow what we did previously. So we're going to switch this to just max width 1024 for the time being. We'll save that, refresh here, and start to scale down. There's our first change. Scale down a little bit more. There's our second change, and it's basically everything we talked about. The nav now falls underneath this heading area, a little less margin between everything. This image now fills the content container, and there's a little less margin between each of these elements, and everything's just a little more narrow. Now let's take a look at iPad Portrait. So let's resize Safari back up, add another comment for iPad Portrait mode. We would use the identical media query that we used for iPad Landscape originally, which is max device width is 1024, and the orientation, instead of landscape, we would actually use portrait. In this case, to be able to preview it on a desktop browser, I'm actually just going to go with the max width property. So it's going to look like this. So again, like before, I'm going to go ahead and speed this up. Not too much will have changed between the iPad Landscape and the iPad Portrait mode, so we don't have to review all of the CSS, but we will preview the site after I'm finished. Okay, now that that's done, let's take a look at what we're dealing with here. So we go back to Safari and we refresh. So we start to scale down. We hit our first change. There is iPad in Landscape. Scale down some more. There is iPad in Portrait. The one thing to note is that I've opted to make this a single column layout right now. So this all looks the same. Banner, nav, we start to scroll down a little bit. And I've actually moved the sidebar underneath our main content, so the about and the recent articles now appear here next to each other, and the footer falls in place just as it normally would. So thus far we have created 4 separate layouts using absolutely all of the same code as far as the HTML goes, just adjusting CSS properties. We have one more device to cover, and that would be a mobile, a smartphone. So let's do that and see what we can do. We'll start out with another comment. The very last thing we want to do is make the design fluid if it gets any more narrow than, let's say, 600 pixels. So what we'll do is we'll remove the banner and the sidebar in order to focus on the main content. So again, I will go through the code in fast forward, and then we'll swing back and review everything that I've done, and I'll go through each individual step. Okay, and now that is done. So let's take one final look at our page with all of these changes. Actually, let's go through this really quickly. So what I've done was I've specified a max width of 600 pixels. With the container and the content divs, which are the two main divs, I set the float to none and the width to inherit, so that it will inherit the width of whatever the surrounding container is, or if not the container, then the whole document. Content, I set the margin to 0 because it initially had a margin right of 20 pixels. Sidebar and banner, they're both display none. Header, I've adjusted some bottom margin. I set the text align to center. Same goes for the H group, and I've set the width to 100%. The header H group H1 and H2 have changed font sizes. The nav, no float, clear both. The width of the UL is 100. For the LIs, I've set the float to none, display block, width 100%, the font size to be 14. Now they're text align left, and the border bottom of each of them is a dark brown. The last child, I've also specified that, but I've removed the bottom border. And for the A's, the links within those, I've given a little bit of padding to make things branch out a little bit. For the content article, I've brought the padding down from 20 to 10 pixels, and I've removed the border radius that rounded the corners. For the H3 and the P, I've changed the font size, and I've opted to remove the image completely once we get down to this size. And finally, for the footer, I've matched the padding to the other elements above, and I've brought the font size down a little bit to 12 pixels. So let's take a look at this and see what we see. We refresh the page. We scale down. There's our first change for slightly smaller viewports, less than 1200 pixels. There is iPad in landscape. There is iPad in portrait. And here is our mobile layout. And this scales all the way down to here. So you'll see that text is all centered. The nav is now list items. Everything has significantly less margin and padding. The font sizes are smaller and easier to digest on this smaller view. And everything lines up really quite nicely. So with literally the same HTML and just a few additional lines of CSS, depending on how many devices you want to target, you can successfully create 4, 5, 6, 7 unique user experiences depending on the device or browser size. It's a lot simpler and more eloquent than redirecting users to completely different mobile sites that need to be maintained separately, and it still keeps our code nice and lightweight and easy to change. I want to show you one more thing, like I promised earlier in the video, and a couple screenshots for your review. So, if you didn't feel like actually having your media queries at the bottom of your CSS file, you wanted to call them in separately, you can do that. And the way to do that is to call it in pretty much like this. What we want to do is link rel equals, if I could spell, style sheet. We want to do media, and we'll skip that for a second, and href, and you would have this, path to style.css, something like that. Now, in this media tag is actually where you just specify your media query. So you might say something like screen and max device with 480 pixels, and that would target a smartphone, and you would be able to display that on a desktop browser. And any of the media queries that we went over, the ones that started with @media, you can actually just use them in here, and only when this condition is met will this style sheet be called in. And that's basically how you would do that if you want to keep your style sheets a little bit more segmented. Here are just a few screenshots of what the website looks like on an iPad in landscape, an iPad in portrait, and on the iPhone. So as you can see, media queries are a super powerful technology, and it's inspiring, and it's something that's actually reinvigorated me as far as my coding goes and has made me reevaluate how I approach a project. The only caveat is that responsive sites usually require a bit more planning initially, but the time saved and ease of use totally make up for the extra time spent in the UI and design phases. This is Andrew Gormley for net.tutsplus.com, and thank you for watching.